All right, joining me now, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., presidential candidate, independent, and doing really well, ranging from 10 to 15 points, which is gigantic for a third-party candidate. Bobby, welcome. Good to see you.
Cenk, thanks for having me on the show. It's good to be back with you.
All right. So, look, we're going to give you a fair hearing here, unlike the rest of the media. So we agree on some things, as you know. We disagree on some things, as you know. So, but I want people to understand how media generally works because it's so important to politics. So, for example, a lot of people have been talking about, oh, the worm that was the parasite in your brain, etc. But that wasn't a recent thing, was it, Bobby? That was from a while back. And so tell me about how a story like that comes up at a moment like this.
That was something that happened to me almost 15 years ago. And it was the subject of a question that they asked me during a deposition about my divorce. The New York Times went back and dug up, in their explorations of my past life, they dug up that deposition and then they did a story on it. So, but a lot of people thought that I had actually made an announcement that I have a worm in my brain.
Yeah.
So I learned from the publicity that that was attended to that, to all of the Sturm and Drang around that people have this same parasite, and it's very common. My doctors originally thought that I got it from eating undercooked meat in India, but you can also get it. I learned this, recently. You also can get it from hog production farms. And as you know, I spent a lot of years litigating against those. I spent a lot of time in and out of these big factory farms, and apparently it's a pretty common parasite among farmers who are running those operations. So I guess I could have gotten it there too.
Yeah, so the reason I bring that up is because what we try to do is we look at it and go, okay, but why is it coming up now, right? And would it come up against any normal candidate that's a Democrat or Republican, or is this a thing that they do to outsiders where they go and dig and dig and dig and try to find something? And the second part of it is, I looked it up as well. It turns out it's not a billion. It's 1.7 billion people that have that parasite. And so now that's the context that you never hear, right? So right-wing media was pretty good to you when you first started because you were in the Democratic primary, let's keep it real, and they were trying to hurt Biden with it. Now right-wing media hates you too, and all of a sudden they're finding things and they're throwing stuff at you. Mainstream media hasn't been exactly kind to you. So who do you think is worse in your experience, mainstream media or right-wing media?
Well, do you mean worse?
Worse to you?
I think the mainstream media, the kind of liberal, and the networks, CNN, MSNBC, ABC, NBC, CBS, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and then all the kind of liberal news sites are, but number one, they won't let me on to do live interviews, with one exception, which was Aaron Burnett, which was recent. But none of them have let me on for many, many years to do live interviews, and to this day, they won't let me on. So, we're hoping to crack that, and I think that's one of the reasons I do very poorly among baby boomers. So I beat President Trump and President Biden among Americans under 35. In the battleground states, I'm beating them in Americans under 45. I'm beating them among independent voters, which are now the biggest demographic. This is the first presidential election in history where self-identified independents outnumber Republicans or Democrats. Self-identified independents represent about 43% of the voting bloc, whereas Democrats are 27, Republicans are 27. And I think one of the reasons that I do so well among independents and young people is because they're getting their news from long-form interviews. They're looking at alternative news sites. I asked my son Connor recently, and Connor's 28 and very well informed. Went to great schools and was very curious. And I asked him, "Have you ever seen a television news show?" like an evening news show, and he went, nope. So you have a whole generation that is, is looking elsewhere. But the people who watch the television news are baby boomers. And I think baby boomers should, you would think, like me, because a lot of them remember the, Camelot, the Kennedy era. I was a big hero to them when I was just an environmental champion and before I started talking about public health issues. But they are the one group where that's my Achilles heel. If I make inroads in baby boomers, I'll win the election. If I can't get into that cohort, then I lose.
Yeah, so we're going to get to things that we disagree on in a second, but it is rather startling, I mean, when you think about it, because I've seen you peak at 18% in polls, and for a third-party candidate, that is a monster number. That is a gigantic number.
Well, I got the Deseret News did a poll this week that has me tied at 20% with Biden. And
overall?
Yeah.
Okay, that seems like an outlier.
In a three-way race. No, I think it's true in Utah, not overall.
Oh, in Utah. Okay, yeah. Okay.
But then, the Quinnipiac poll, I think, had me at 27 points in Michigan. I'm at 26 in Arizona. And all I need to do is get to 34 to win the election. And a lot of the polls that have me in single digits are fixed polls. So they do something that they have never done before, which is they pose the question as if it's a two-way race between President Biden and President Trump, and then they offer or other. So most people, they say, if you had to vote between these two, which one is it? And for those who push other, they are sent to a different field, and then they're asked about me, Cornel West, and Jill Stein. So it's a two-step process to get to me. And
no, that's so unfair.
Right, and we know because Quinnipiac did it both ways at one point. And we saw that when they did it the regular way, as it would appear on the ballot, that I was 17 or 18 points. Whereas when they did it the second way, then I dropped down to 9 or 10 points.
So does CNN ever give you a reason why they wouldn't do a town hall with a guy that's anywhere between 8 to 18 points?
Well, they didn't have to give me a reason. Jake Tapper went on the air and said, I will never have Robert Kennedy at a town hall.
Well, okay.
So,
what if you win? I don't know. And then maybe going to have a town hall?
But actually, it's interesting because this week, Anderson Cooper, who, and I've been very critical of Anderson Cooper during the pandemic and during the lockdowns. And I know that he and I knew each other over time, kind of acquaintances, and had a decent relationship, but he's been very, very antagonistic toward me. And he actually did a very nice show about me this week for the first time. So, where they were interviewing people who are my supporters and trying to figure out, what's wrong with them. Do they have a worm in their brain?
What's wrong with them? Okay, see, look, I don't mind people not liking you, and I don't mind people voting against you, as long as they know what they're actually voting for. And I think that the rest of the media does a great disservice when they don't actually hear you out. So let's hear you out. So, Bobby, as you know, I don't agree with you on vaccines because we've talked about it before. And so help me understand this. So if you say to me, hey, listen, Big Pharma is lying about X, Y, or Z, that doesn't seem inconceivable to me at all. Big Pharma, I can't stand them for a number of reasons, for all the reasons that you sued them in the past and the damage that they've caused in different cases, for the fact that they're preventing us from negotiating drug prices. So I'm not convinced by mainstream media or the lobbyists, et cetera. But when I go to talk to about the COVID vaccine, every doctor I know, every scientist I know, they say the entire medical community and themselves say that it does work and that you're wrong about it. So do you see, Bobby, why it seems like you're asking a lot of people by saying, no, believe me, instead of what appears to be the entire medical community?
Yeah, first of all, I bet you if you and I talked about vaccines and actually looked at data, you would agree with me on almost everything. But let me just, before I answer that question, let me basically outline how I stand on vaccines. vaccines, no vaccine is safe and effective for everyone. There are certain numbers of people, the Supreme Court said, vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. That's when they upheld the immunity from liability. They said unavoidably unsafe. You cannot make them completely safe for everybody. So, and if you look at the list on a manufacturer's inserts, there's 420 injuries that are listed on the manufacturer's inserts from vaccines. My concern is the people who get injured. And I think, and the medical community's reaction to those people is that we shouldn't talk about them because it will sow doubt about vaccines if you even admit anybody's getting injured. The vaccine courts have paid out billions of dollars in injuries, so the injury is real, it's undeniable, and it's on the manufacturer's insert of every vaccine, and they're very serious injuries, including death. Whether they're rare or not, I think we should be able to talk about them. There are kids with rare cancers, and we talk about them. And if somebody has a vaccine injury, we ought to be able to, and the scientists and doctors who are treating them ought to be given a fair hearing. And that's really where I come down. I think we should have good science, and we all should have informed consent, which means everybody knows we have really good science that tells us what all the answers about efficacy and safety. Everybody knows what the side effects are, and you can make an informed choice about it, and we shouldn't be mandating them to people. That's really, if you love your vaccines, I'm not going to take them away from you. I'm just going to give you good science, and I'm going to try to make them as safe as possible. Now, you pointed out the pharmaceutical industry is not a trustworthy industry. It's a criminal cartel, and I don't say that lightly. The 4 companies that make all of the vaccines, the 72 vaccines now mandated for our children, all of them in their other products have paid, I think, $79 billion in criminal penalties. They haven't paid anything with vaccines because vaccines are immune from liability. So you cannot, no matter how negligent that company is, no matter how reckless they are, no matter how grievous your injury, you can't sue them. And you know and I know that if you tell a company that we can sue you if you do something wrong, they're going to be more careful about it.
Yeah.
And if you tell, these are companies that have been showing, for example, Vioxx. Merck knew that Vioxx caused heart attacks, but it didn't tell its customers. It marketed as a headache pill and an arthritis pill. And so the customers went and took it, and maybe hundreds of thousands of people died as the result. Many of those people would have said, if they knew that it could kill them, they would have said, I'll take an aspirin instead. But they weren't told that. And Merck did that deliberately. They ended up paying about $7 billion in the end, but they still made money on the product. So what if you could tell Merck, here's a product you'll never have to, no matter what happens, no matter how sloppy you are, no matter reckless, no matter how toxic the ingredient, you'll never have to pay anybody any downstream liability. You can bet that they're probably not going to behave if you waive all liability. So that's something we should be concerned about. But as president, what I would do is I would get rid of that immunity. I would lift the immunity and make them accountable and make them responsible, because that's the only way to ensure the safety of this product. I would say this about the COVID vaccine. You remember at the beginning of COVID, we were told that if you take that vaccine, because you just said, the medical community all says it works. Well, what does that mean? Because originally they told us it would stop transmission, and that if you
Not really. No, they didn't.
No, but check. You can go on. There's whole reels out there on YouTube that your listeners can go to right now with Tony Fauci saying, if you get this, you cannot spread it to grandma. You cannot spread it to anybody in your family. You are protecting other people by getting this. Well, that's because we were told that it would prevent transmission. Otherwise, how it's going to protect other people? We were guilted into it. We were shamed into it because they said it stops transmission dead.
Right.
And they all said this. Bill Gates said it. Tony Fauci said it. Elizabeth Burke said it. Robert Redfield said it. Joe Biden said it. They have them on tape again and again and again. That wasn't true. And they knew it wasn't true at the time. And I was saying at the time, it can't prevent transmission. Why was I saying that? Because I was actually reading the science. In May of 2020, I read the monkey studies. And the monkey studies showed that the animals that were vaccinated were getting levels in of concentrations of SARS-CoV-2 in their nasal pharynx that were equivalent to the unvaccinated. So it was clear then to anybody who looked at those studies that it was not going to prevent transmission or infection. So I would say, and if you look, and then I'll just say one other thing. All around the world, there are countries that were heavily vaccinated, and there were countries that were essentially unvaccinated. And I'm not saying this is a correlation. It does not prove causation. But for example, our country, which was one of the most heavily vaccinated in the world, had the highest body count from COVID of any nation on earth. So we lost 16% of the American people. We had 16% of the COVID deaths in this country. We only have 4.2% of the world's population. So we literally did worse than any nation on earth. Now, we were told at the beginning by Anthony Fauci and Bill Gates, et cetera, that the nations that were going to get wiped out were the nations that couldn't afford the vaccine, specifically Haiti and Nigeria. Haiti had a 1.3% vaccination rate, and the death rate from COVID was 14 people per million population. Our death rate, American blacks, 3,000 per million population. In Nigeria,
right, but
1.4. Now, that doesn't mean the vaccine had anything to do with it. But what it means is it's something we should be studying.
But Bobby, look, let me just jump in. So number one, if you say, hey, let's study it, of course. I don't think any rational. No, but I don't think that's all you're saying, though. Hold on. So I think almost all rational people, including scientists and doctors, certainly say study it, of course, right? If you say, hey, the medical community said some things that were wrong at different times, like for example, Dr. Fauci said you don't need to wear masks in the beginning. Then later they changed it to you do have to wear masks. You lose faith with people when you do that. But it's relatively easy for someone like us that care about the news to suss out those things. I said that doesn't make any sense when they said, oh, a virus broke out right next to a virology lab, but it didn't come from the lab. That doesn't make sense. But at the same time, when I'm not the expert on it, you say that you are an expert on it. I can't debate you like on every single thing on Nigeria. So I do know there's a ton of factors. It might depend on the density of the population as opposed to the vaccine.
Of course, the age of the population.
Right, and then you see countries like Sweden that gave up on their experiment of not sequestering people, right? So they were out and open, and then their COVID rate was out of control, and they had to bring people back in.
They ended up having the lowest COVID rate in Europe.
So there's a lot of data, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
So, but sometimes you do have to make things mandatory. I'm not saying every time, right? And that's a tough judgment call. So for example, on some vaccines, polio, smallpox, others, you might have to make it mandatory. George Washington made it mandatory for his army. He lost a third of his army, but won the war. And if he hadn't done that, if he hadn't made it mandatory, we're probably still living under England right now. So there are some circumstances where mandatory does make sense. So the main question is, for people who like your other policies, if the scientists and the doctors come in and say, Bobby, this one has to be mandatory. Here's the reasons why, here's all the data, et cetera. Are you going to listen to them?
Listen, under some extreme circumstance, I may look at that and say this is so obvious, but the problem is you have a medical cartel that is tied inextricably to the pharmaceutical industry and is more concerned with promoting the mercantile interests of the pharmaceutical companies than in public health, and they've shown that again and again and again. So listen, if you have a product that clearly works and there's a disease with a high infection rate, people are going to line up to take that product. I would leave it to the individual. I wouldn't say that that the government should ever be mandating a medical product to, that you're going to do to your body. And we all agreed that after World War II, with we signed the Nuremberg Code, there were trials just for doctors. At the end, they were called the doctor trials at Nuremberg, because the medical community was so badly behaved in the Third Reich.
But you don't think that's what's happening with doctors in America? I mean, how is every doctor I know saying you're wrong? You think they're all wrong?
Well, first of all, there's, I think, 76,000 doctors have signed a petition essentially supporting my position. So it's not every doctor.
Okay, not every, that's fair, but definitely a very small minority of doctors.
Well, yeah, but the question is, are the doctors, do they hold that opinion because they're reading a scientific study, or do they hold that opinion because the CDC told them this product works? And that's what I would ask the doctor. I'd say to him, show me the study that you're basing that opinion on. Because I read science, that's what I do for a living. I read science for a living. I've tried something like 500 cases. Almost all of them involve scientific controversies. And my job is to deconstruct science and and cross-examine and direct examine witnesses and find out whether they really are basing their opinion on something that is factual and is solid. So, and I think a lot of times doctors and the medical profession, they're so busy, they're not actually going out and reading the science. They're taking the word of CDC. This works, this product works. You should be recommending it. The AAP, the American Association of Pediatrics, makes these recommendations and establishes medical care protocols, but they get about 80% of their money from pharmaceutical companies. So don't we have to be worried, and shouldn't we be worried that those decisions are influenced by the money that they're getting by these conflicts of interest?
Well, I do worry about it. I worried about it in the OxyContin context. And so that's why I've got the credibility to be able to say, like, I see when they're doing wrong, but at the same time, I see when they're doing right.
Cenk, you know what? This is a really, really good example that you just brought up. OxyContin. Every doctor in America was prescribing OxyContin and telling their patients it's not addictive. Why? Because FDA lied. It colluded with Purdue and the other pharmaceutical companies to lie to the American public to make billions. That is a good example,
because you're right about that. And it wasn't every doctor, but it was too many doctors. And then they set up junkets to get the doctors to Vegas and have a good time,
and the vaccine companies do the exact same thing.
No, I hear you on that, brother. But what happened with Oxy was eventually the doctor said, no, this isn't right.
No.
This
eventually,
isn't right.
What happened is there was litigation. And the litigation woke the doctors up.
I'm in favor of the litigation.
Right,
I'm
but you can't
in favor of all the work that you've done in the past on that front.
Right, but
the doctors now do say, oh, it's definitely addictive. But they've never said that about the vaccines that you complain about. And it's not just COVID, goes back 20 years.
Cenk, this is what I'm saying. They changed their mind because of the litigation. All the discovery that came about because of that became public because of that litigation. What if you could never sue those companies? The doctors would still be writing those prescriptions. With vaccines, you cannot sue them. So they can keep all those documents secret. So imagine it's the same companies, it's the exact same companies, but with vaccines, they cannot be sued.
Yeah, I think that there's a way to thread the needle where you could do a lawsuit maybe after some period of emergency has passed, et cetera.
You can't. Believe me.
I know we can't today.
But there's hundreds and hundreds of lawyers that have been trying to figure this out that have injured clients. And you cannot sue these companies.
Right. So let's go to the environment, because you've done a lot of litigation in the past, and that's part of why you were considered on the left. And someone who the press celebrated as on the left, et cetera. You sued DuPont a couple of times, won an enormous number of cases. So on environmental regulation, you have been terrific in the past and in climate change. So tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but right now you say that you're criticizing green energy subsidies, you're for more oil drilling, and you are against the ban on fracking, and you're supporting free market solutions to the climate crisis. So that doesn't sound like it jives with what I knew in the past. Am I getting that any of those facts wrong?
Yeah, you're getting those facts wrong. But if you go back and look at my speeches from 40 years ago, I always said the answer ultimately to environmental injury is free market capitalism. And we don't have that in our country. We have corporate crony capitalism. And in a free market, a true free market, the actors in the marketplace would have to pay all the costs of getting that product to market, including the cost of cleaning up after themselves, which is a lesson we were all supposed to have learned in kindergarten. But they don't have to do that because they're allowed by corruption and by control of the corporate control, the merger of state and corporate power, to externalize those costs and to get subsidies. And subsidies are a violation of the free market. So the carbon industry gets $5.2 trillion in subsidies every year. $5.2 trillion. That's why green energy is not competing against them. What I would do is end those subsidies to carbon. And in a true free market, a true free market promotes efficiency. And efficiency means the elimination of waste, and pollution is waste. In a true free market, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich and without enriching your community. What polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for everybody else, and they do that by escaping the discipline of the free market. You show me a polluter, I'll show you a subsidy. I'll show you a fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay his production costs.
So, but let's dive into something that's really important there, though.
Yeah.
So I agree with you on all of that. In fact, it's going to lead in a moment to something we massively agree on corporate influence in politics. But help me understand this part. So when you say support free market solutions, if that means, okay, well, let's just let the market sort it out, well, that's one thing. If it means, hey, listen, you guys caused climate change, I'm going to make you pay for climate change. So hurricane hits Louisiana, that's an externality of your product, and I'm going to make you pay for it. Well, that's a different thing, right? And so which one do you mean?
Well, I mean that they should pay for their environmental externalities. I would not, it's problematical to me to use, at this point, to hold them accountable for climate change. But I don't think that you need to, because there's so many other externalized costs that are associated with carbon. And let me give you a few examples. And if the industry had to pay those costs, it could not compete. For example, right now, I spend 15 years of my life as a partner in the biggest green tech venture capital firm in the world. It's called Vantage Point. We were the biggest and first investors in Tesla. We built, and I was personally involved with building the biggest solar thermal plant in our country. I was involved in building the biggest PVC plant, solar PVC in North America. I was deeply involved in the cost, and I know what the costs are. The cost today of building a solar plant is about $1 billion a gigawatt. The cost of building a wind is about $1.1 billion a gigawatt. The cost of building a coal plant is $3.6 billion. And when you build a wind or solar plant, it's free energy forever. When you build that coal plant, now you got to go cut down the Appalachian Mountains. They've buried 2,200 miles of rivers and streams, which is all illegal. That cost should have been internalized. You have to burn the coal, that puts mercury in the environment. Every freshwater fish in our country is now contaminated with mercury. They should have to externalize that cost. There's $500 billion a year in respiratory injuries from ozone and particulates. They should have to internalize those costs. Acid rain has now destroyed the forest cover on the high peaks of the Appalachian from Georgia to northern Quebec. It's sterilized 1 out of every 5 lakes in the Adirondacks where I grew up. They should have to internalize those costs. If they had to internalize those costs, you wouldn't be paying 16 cents a kilowatt hour for coal burning energy. You'd be paying $3 and $4 and coal could never compete against more efficient forms of generation. Oh, but now if you talk, I'm trying, one of the objectives of my campaign is to end the polarization, the division. The environment should be a unifying issue, and it can be if you talk about it right. If your solutions are aligned, everybody in this country, Republicans, Democrats, want clean water. They want clean air. They want to get rid of the toxics that are poisoning their children, their environment. When we did the protests in Flint, Michigan over the lead crisis, we had Hell's Angels standing shoulder to shoulder with urban blacks. When we went to Standing Rock, we had union people, we had business people, Republicans, Democrats, all flocking to Standing Rock. Because we didn't sell it as a climate issue. We sold it as protecting a sacred place, and every American wants that. So, if you want to just talk about climate, Jack, you're going to have a fistfight every time. But if you talk about habitat protection, if you talk about clean air, clean water, saving our aquifers, improving our food supply, these issues unite everybody. There are no such thing as Republican or Democratic children. Everybody wants their kids to have a clean environment. And so that's what I focus on rather than focusing on explicitly climate. And this is not new to this presidential election. I learned this 30 years ago when I was working for Waterkeeper, and people, I was talking to working people whose livelihoods depended on a clean environment. If I talked about climate, their eyes glazed over. If you talk about clean water, they're saying we're going to go to the barricades with you. And we're going to die on this hill.
So, Bobby, one last thing on this. I understand all of that, and I appreciate the framing that you're putting behind it. I get the value of that framing, the correct framing, and I get that not only did you sue people to effectuate this kind of change and win, I get that you got arrested for protesting Keystone XL pipeline. I get all that.
And I spent a whole summer in maximum security prison in Puerto Rico for suing the Navy to stop the bombing of Vieques for water and air pollution.
Yeah, that's right. That's all correct. So, but one thing I want to make clear though is, because again, the devil's in the details here. If you say, okay, I'm going to take their externalities like coal creates, and I'm going to make them pay it, that is regulation. Right. So look, I get it that you don't want to talk about it in terms of regulation.
No, I'm happy to call it whatever you want.
But I don't want you to go if we were to if you go into office and then you go, oh well, I was using the framing, so you know what? I'm not going to regulate them. I'm just going to let the free market decide.
No.
That defeats the whole point.
No, I'm not.
You see what I'm saying?
Listen, markets. A market has to be regulated to do what it's supposed to do, which is, the free market. Capitalism is the greatest economic engine ever devised, but it has to be harnessed to its social purpose. Otherwise, it will gallop us down the road to oligarchy, to corporate kleptocracy, to aristocracy, and away from democracy. So every market works by rules, and what we want is we want to write rules that allow people to do well by doing good, rather than forcing them to do well by hurting other people. So every market needs rules. There is no market that does not have a set of rules. So if you have a set of rules that says that, you can make money by polluting the environment and you're allowed to externalize all those costs, there's going to be a race to the bottom and everybody's going to do that. But if you say to people, you can't pollute, but we want you to create energy, and we're not going to put a lot of regulatory problems. If you can figure out how to do that without hurting people, then you're going to see this ferment of entrepreneurial energy that our country is famous for, and it's going to solve these problems very, very quickly.
So let's go to another form of deregulation that happened through the Supreme Court, where they basically said, you can just give whatever you want to politicians. And so that happened basically in 76 and 78 before Citizens United, and they, in my opinion, legalized bribery. And you see every chart diverge in 1978, worker pay flatlines, corporate profits go up, etc. So how do we get that under control? You're concerned about corporate rule, and as well as I am, and our audiences for sure. But how do we stop the money in politics from buying off all these politics?
Yeah, I mean, you and I are agreed on this 100% aligned that we need a constitutional amendment because you can't do it because the Supreme Court is not going to let it happen. And just to give a little bit of history, which you're very aware of, We really lost democracy at another time in our history during the 1880s and 1890s. A period called the Gilded Age, when these giant robber baron families, the Carnegies, the Fricks, the Rockefellers, the Mellons, the Morgans, sat on these interlocking boards for all these big trusts, the sugar trust, the oil trust, the rail trust, et cetera. And they controlled politics in this country. This was before the direct election of senators. Those senators were chosen by their state legislatures, and it was very easy for these giant corporate behemoths to control the legislatures. It was said at that time that the Pennsylvania legislature was the only legislature that was not for sale, because John D. Rockefeller owned all of them and wasn't selling any of them. So this is, and they were selecting the senators, they controlled the party, they were selecting the president, and we didn't have democracy. You had this confluence that I think we can take encouragement from today. You had a populist movement rising in the countryside. You had a progressive movement, which was Republican, rising in the city. The populist movement was Democrat. You had muckraking journalists like Ida Tarbell and Upton Sinclair, who were working for McClure's magazine and writing these extraordinary exposés about the robber barons. And then you had Teddy Roosevelt, who came out of the oligarchy, but was not scared or intimidated by it. And at the beginning, after his election in 1903, we had the first passage of the income tax in this country. We had the direct election of senators. We had the 40-hour work week that was passed. We gave women the vote. We allowed unions to organize. We banned child labor, and all these bills that re-democratized our country. But the most important bill was a bill that was passed in 2008 and made it illegal for corporations to give financial contributions to federal political candidates. That law, more than any other law, turned our country back into a democracy. And that law lasted for 100 years, almost exactly to the day. So this very business-friendly Supreme Court overturned it in the Citizens United case. And that Citizens United case is insidious because the court did something to imbue constitutional protection on federal political contributions. It said that a contribution of money is a form of free speech. You can't regulate it because that would be an attack on the First Amendment. It's insane. There's no other country in the world that has that rule, and it's destroyed our country. It has unleashed a tsunami of money that has made it, that has put government so far away from ordinary Americans. This presidential election, I've read that it's going to cost $15 to $20 billion. So President Trump and President Biden and the parties have to raise that money, mainly in $10,000 increments from the richest people in the country, and then they have to take all those people's phone calls. And that
I think they're just glorified servants, to be honest. I mean, and it ranges from 10,000 to independent expenditures. I can get to up to $100 million per person.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be unlimited, but Sheldon Adelson has given $100 million twice to Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020. His widow now, Miriam Adelson, considering giving him another 90 to 100
million. They give it to the super PAC or two.
They give it to a super PAC that then spends it for Trump. And then all of a sudden, Adelson's charges go away. They ban internet gambling because he has casinos in Vegas. And his wife gets Presidential Medal of Freedom, et cetera. So obvious and open bribery in not just in it's obvious. There's just, and it's not just Trump, Biden, corporate Democrats, corporate Republicans. Mitch McConnell raises $1 billion. Democrats go, of course he's in the tank for his corporate donors. Nancy Pelosi raises $1 billion from the same people, and they go, oh no, she's an angel. No, they're both in the tank for their donors. There's no question about it. So, but now when we talk about solutions, so you say yes amendment. Yes, corruption definitely exists. This is legalized bribery. Yes amendment.
We need an amendment of the Constitution.
How about Article 5 convention, where so two ways to get an amendment. One is through Congress, but they got elected through corruption, so they're not going to say yes. The other way is to go through the states.
We have to go through the states. And as president, I'm going to do that. I'm going to go to each one of the states and urge them to pass this law. And the implementation of that law is contingent on all the other states passing it. So there's no risk for the state until everybody else agrees on it. And I think it can get done, and I'm going to work very hard, because if we don't do that, we don't have democracy anymore. We do not have a democracy now, because the little guy in this country has absolutely no say in what's happening with his government. And I think that's part of the reason the rise in this violence and the polarization, et cetera. People know that they don't own their government anymore, that the system's rigged, it's rigged against them, and it's rigged to shift money upward. And it's like a vacuum cleaner. All of these, the Fed and all of these, all of our laws and institutions are designed to strip mine wealth from the American middle class and send it north, And during COVID, it was kind of the shutdowns that we saw during COVID were kind of the coup de grace in the American middle class. They closed 3.3 million businesses with no due process, no just compensation. And, all of this, $4.3 trillion in wealth were shifted from the American middle class to this new oligarchy of billionaires. President Biden and President Trump created 500 billionaires in 500 days, a billionaire a day globally. But it was these policies that they adopted, and it was, it really destroyed the middle class, not only in our country, but all over Western Europe as well.
Yeah, and so whether we agree on the shutdowns, the vaccine or not, the wealth did shift, and it has been shifting throughout for the last 40, 50 years, and it's obviously because they're paying the politicians, and then politicians are passing laws that allow them to make more and more money. And this also happened during the 2008 housing crisis. In the recovery in 2010, 94% of the gains went to the top 1%. So it happens under Democrats, it happens under Republicans. Yeah, they should have gone to jail, they didn't.
They became billionaires.
So let me ask you a specific question about one of the effects of that corruption. By the way, again, I preface that as we totally agree, because I started a PAC called Wolfpack to get money out of politics to do exactly that. So I couldn't agree more on that. Housing, that is another area where the banks are coming in, starting to buy all the residential real estate. And again, both the corporate Democrats and Republicans say there's nothing we could do. We have to just let them buy all the real estate, and the housing prices are going through the roof. What's your answer?
Yeah, I mean, just kind of state where we are. 2 years ago, the average price in the house was $223,000. The average price of a home, $223,000. Today, it's about $415,000, and the interest rates have gone from 3% to 7%. So a kid trying to get that house is it's out of reach, and part of the reason is just inflation, which is driven by this, basically the war economy and the war machine. And, President Biden and President Trump each running up $8 trillion. President Trump said he was going to balance the budget. And in 4 years, he spent more money than every president from George Washington to George W. Bush combined, 283 years of history. And that money, of course, they didn't levy taxes. They just printed, and that printing it is a theft, because it caused inflation, and inflation is a tax on the poor, on working people, on anybody with fixed incomes. It is a theft, and it is and Biden is now doing the same thing. Oh, we have inflation, but the inflation in housing is different than anything else. It is exponential, and one of the principal reasons for that is you have these giant corporations, particularly BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, also Fidelity, but those three companies which are the biggest corporations in the world. BlackRock, I think, is the third largest economy in the world. If you just look at, at its assets, $16 trillion in assets under management, but those three companies own 89% of the S&P 500. So they own the economy, and now they're trying to buy up all the agricultural land and all of the all the single-family homes, residential housing. So our kids who are trying to get into a house are competing for the cost of money with the biggest companies in the world that have not only a perfect credit rating, but below. The amount that they pay is almost zero for cash. And they have to compete with them. And, I'll tell you, the punchline is that I'm going to, the day that I get into office, and we already have a bill written, I'm going to put in a bill to make it illegal for investment houses to own single-family homes, to buy them, mass purchase single-family homes. It's wrong. We don't have to do it. We can regulate it. We can make it illegal.
Just make it illegal for private equity to buy residential
to buy
homes.
Huge numbers. You may have a limit on how many that they buy, but it's not going to be 10,000. Last year, I think 30% of the houses purchased in this country were purchased by them. And we all know people who went out, who were about to go buy a home, and they went into escrow, and they were about to sign a contract, and at the last minute, somebody comes in with a cash offer, 20% above the asking price, and snatch that home off the market, and the person's left saying, who is this who just stole my home? And then you find it's an LLC when you look into it with an ambiguous name, and when you start following the strings, it leads you to BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and Fidelity.
Yeah, I'll tell you, on this issue alone, you've got a shot at winning, because if we don't start the private equity guys from buying all the homes, we're not going to be able to create any wealth in this country anymore, because our homes are where we create our wealth.
Exactly. After World War II, we had the biggest middle class. We invented the middle class in our country. And part of it, when I was a kid, my uncle was president in the beginning of the 60s. We owned half the wealth on the face of the earth and our country. And part of that was because...
I thought you said the Kennedys.
I
believed it, but...
No, we owned a much smaller piece of it. But part of the reason was because we had obliterated, the World War II had obliterated the industrial base of Europe, and our base was, was in great shape and cooking. But more importantly, after World War II, with the GI Bill, with the highway system, and a lot of other legislation, we got every American into a home. So, and once you get into a home, something magical happens. First of all, you care about your community. You care about your police. You care about your transportation. You care about your the firefighters. You go to the PTA meetings. You care about your lawn, the appearance of your house, your neighbors, et cetera. But more importantly, you now have equity. So if you have an entrepreneurial impulse, you can pursue it. You can take a second mortgage on your home and bet that to build a yoga studio or a sporting goods store or a saloon or whatever, a bowling alley. And so that you had this huge ferment of small business, which 90% of the new jobs that were created in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s were all coming from small business. And that was the driving force in American capitalism. It also stabilized our country. It created this middle class. So the stratification between rich or poor was shrunk. And when you eliminate the middle class, which we've done now, and you have this new oligarchy of billionaires, and you have widespread poverty below, that configuration is too unstable to support democracy sustainably. So we're going to lose democracy if we don't have a middle class, and we don't have one anymore. We are killing it. There's 61% of the people in this country cannot put their hands on $500 if they have an emergency. And if you live in that cohort, Cenk, and the engine light comes on in your car, it is the apocalypse, because you're not going to be able to pay the mechanic. You can't get to your job. You're not going to be able to pay your rent. You're going to end up on the street. And there's this great economist in San Francisco who's looked at homelessness, right? And I always thought, you go to San Francisco and it's crazy there right now. Mm-hmm. Los Angeles California has 50% of the homeless people in our country. In California. Mm-hmm. You say, why is that? And you go and you say, you know, it has something to do with drug addiction. It has something to do with mental illness, because a lot of these people look mentally ill. But what they find when they look at it is that the drug addiction is a very small part of it. And a lot of people who are homeless are mentally ill, but they become mentally ill after they become homeless. You spend a couple of days on the grate, and you start to lose, your reality starts to warp. The one correlation is housing prices. The higher the housing price, and California is the highest housing price, the more homeless you are. So those people are just like every other American. They just had two flat tires at the same time, and you know, they couldn't get into a home.
So I think homelessness has a lot of range of factors, and meth skyrocketing is affected it. But overall, there's no question, California has the 4 highest cities for housing prices in the country. All 4 are in California, and housing prices out of control in California, more homeless in California. But the main point is on the equity that we lose in our homes alone, we will be permanently serfs of private equity and bankers.
We're going from an ownership society to a rental society, and when that happens, we go from being citizens to being subjects. It is a feudal model, it's a colonial model, it's the model we fled in Europe, and now we're bringing it here to this country.
So, okay, now that we've done those agreements, back to disagreements. Okay, so as I see that, and I think on housing proposals, money and politics proposals alone, you've got me very interested, right? So then I look at your what you say about Gaza, and I want to tear out all my hair. Okay, so so help me try to understand what you're thinking here. You talk in such harsh language about the Palestinians, talking about bombing them to denazify them. Last I checked, you still were not for a ceasefire after 37,000 dead. You know, you talk of Palestinians oftentimes as terrorists. It's perplexing. So.
Wait a minute, no, I don't talk about Palestinians as terrorists. I don't believe that. I consider myself extremely pro-Palestinian. And by the way, you know, my dad there was a Palestinian who was involved in the murder of my father. He didn't kill him, but he was involved in the ambush. And then my brother, and pled guilty. My brother then was hijacked by Black September, by the Palestinian group 5 years later, and his plane was brought to Yemen and blown up, and you know, with the terrorists demanding the release of the person who was convicted of my father's murder. When Sirhan was convicted, my family wrote a letter to Judge Walker asking him not to apply the death penalty to Sirhan. And you know, as you know, I've been to meet Sirhan. I fought very hard for his release. And, you know, I go by facts. I don't go by passion. I don't go by prejudice. I don't go by pressure. I just don't see how, and I think Hamas is the villain. The Palestinian people are not the villain. Hamas is a terrorist group. It's a terrorist group that is committed to the annihilation of Israel. Hamas has been attacking Israel with rockets, 2,000 rockets a year since 2006. It ended the invasion October 7th. I can't conceive that any other nation in the world, that if they were attacked in that way with that kind of savage brutality by a government or a group that is sworn to the annihilation of their country, that wants nothing else, that will not negotiate for anything else. I don't say how you leave them ruling Gaza and then try to rebuild it. And I want to look. I have a tremendous compassion for what's happening there now. You know, every death there is heartbreaking, and I think all of us feel that way. But it was not. It was Hamas. I blame Hamas, not Israel. So.
Okay, yeah, well, see, that's where you're wrong, because not because Hamas is innocent. No, you blaming Hamas makes sense. They did October 7th. Everyone agrees, great sympathy to Israel, 1,200 people killed in sometimes a brutal fashion, 34 kids killed. So you go after Hamas, I agree with you, okay? But when Israel kills 30 times as many civilians, there's some point, you can't keep saying, oh, Hamas made me keep killing all of your civilians. Golly gee, it was all an accident. I'm the most moral army on earth. I just happened to kill 30 times the number of civilians that Hamas did. And Hamas is a terrible terrorist organization. So at what point do you say, this isn't defending yourself anymore? All of Gaza is destroyed. We all have eyes, we have ears. You know, we say that about Biden. Democrats say, oh no, he's a dynamo. Brother, we got eyes and ears. We can see that the guy can barely talk and walk, right? The MAGA guys say, oh, Trump never lies. Brother, we got eyes and ears. The guy lies all the time. You look at Gaza, they leveled the place. It's gone. And like 85% of them are homeless now. At what point do you draw a line, Bobby, and go, God damn it, that's enough, stop killing them?
I would draw the line when Hamas lays down its weapons and says.
So if Hamas doesn't lay down their weapons, now innocent Palestinian civilians held captive by both the Israel occupation for 57 years, brutal occupation. Okay, hold on, and Hamas. Let's say Hamas.
Wait, no.
Okay, so now, but Israel gets to kill as many Palestinians as they want for ad infinitum, because there's still a couple of Hamas guys left. Well, how do we know when all the Hamas guys are gone? So are you okay with 370,000 dead as long as there's a Hamas battalion left?
Number one, Israel is not occupying Gaza. Israel,
okay, that's crazy.
So, okay. Israel left Gaza in 2006 and Hamas took over Gaza in 2006. And
but they don't control their borders, they don't control their water, their electricity, their power.
Right, and well, first of all, their water comes from desalination plants that are local. Israel has provided fuel from those plants. Gaza, but Hamas blaming Israel for turning them into an open-air prison is like it's like the guy who kills his parents and pleads to the court for mercy because he's an orphan.
But that's Hamas and Palestinians are different, though. You can ignore everything Hamas says, but the Palestinians are definitely occupied. Israel has been brutally oppressing them for 57 years.
Well, wait a minute, Jay.
I mean, are they free? They're not free, are they, Bobby? They're definitely not free.
People in Gaza? Or Palestinians?
Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank, not remotely free.
But Palestinians, there are 1.3 or 2.3 million Palestinians in Israel. It's 17% of the population. And they have all the rights of anybody else in Israel. They can vote, they can serve on the Knesset, they can,
yeah, but how about the 5.5 million that have no freedom? That are in the West Bank and Gaza Strip being kept in prisons for decade after decade after decade, using the excuse of, well, there's one Hamas guy that says Israel should be annihilated, so we're gonna occupy 5.5 million of you. Well, there's always a jerk who's gonna say, oh, I think Israel should be annihilated, I think this, and not only that, it's a greatly ironic argument that, hey, Hamas doesn't want Israel to be a state, and then Israel turns around and goes, I'm not gonna let the Palestinians be a state. So aren't they worse than Hamas? Because it's not theoretical. They are literally preventing the Palestinians from being a state. That is what you say. Hamas is so terrible because they would prevent Israel from being a state. Well, Israel's already doing that to the Palestinians.
Yeah, so the Palestinians have been offered a state repeatedly in 1922, in 1930. Are you gonna let me finish?
All right, go ahead.
Because you just went on a rampage. Go ahead. Okay. 1922, 1937, 1947, 1973, 1967, 1973. Each time they were offered, Israel offered them, the United Nations offered them, the League of Nations offered them, Britain offered them their own state in exchange for peace. 90% of the Palestinian mandate of Palestine was given to the Arabs. Only 10% was given to the Jews. So
wait, in 1948, no, they got half the land, and when they were only a third of the population.
In 1922.
1922. Okay.
Yeah, 1922.
But Bobby, in 1922, it was all Palestinians. So it's like saying, oh, okay, we're going to take 10% of your land. Are you okay with it? They say, well, no, I don't want you taking 10% of my land. Well, then it became 50%. Now it's like nearly 75%. Okay.
I mean, if you want to go back.
But
the Palestinians sided with the Ottoman Empire, fought with the Ottoman Empire. Mufti al-Hussein, who was the head of the Palestinians, was running the Arab Legion in the Ottoman army. The Ottoman army lost the war, and its empire was broken up. Under Woodrow Wilson's pressure, the League of Nations said, okay, the all of these lands of the Ottoman Empire that were once run by the Ottomans are going to be divided up and given to the local people who live there. The British came in and said, can the Palestinians and Jews live together in one land? First of all, the Jews had fought with Britain. They fought with the Allied powers. Mm-hmm. The Arabs had fought against them. When you lose a war, there's a consequence. Britain made a promise to the Zionists, you will get your own nation. They didn't give them everything they promised. They gave 90% of Palestine to the Arabs, and they left a little sliver, 10%, for the Jews. The Jews started their own nation in 1948. The United Nations approved it, but the Arabs said no. The Arabs were offered their country. The Jews were offered theirs.
So listen, I'm not going to.
Since then,
all right.
Yeah. Okay, so just let me finish. On numerous occasions since, Israel has offered with Ehud Barak, with Yasser Arafat, everything that the Palestinians had previously asked for, which was the 1967 borders. And incidentally, check, up until 1993, the official position of the entire Arab League and the Palestinians is that Israel could not have a state even the size of a postage stamp. Oh,
but they do have a state, Bobby,
right?
And the Palestinians don't. And you want to perpetuate that injustice?
No, but the Israelis have constantly offered them again and again. Let's have your state. We'll trade it for peace.
Okay, so look, I don't want to get into a giant debate about this because we could just debate it for hours.
Yeah.
I'll just say I just want to ask you two questions about it. Look, on the peace treaties, we can go back and forth. You say, oh well, we offered it. I say, yeah, if you come to somebody who says, give me half your house. And the guy goes, why should I give you half my house? No, I reject you. You go, you rejected my peace treaty. Now I'm taking half your house. Now I'm taking 2/3 of your house.
Now you're arguing again, because all of these things I can answer. So if you
come on. Bobby, they started with 10%, now they got 2/3, and you're still saying not enough. Not enough. Well, squeeze the Palestinians more. Squeeze them more. So tell me, when do the Palestinians get a state? Can they do the same exact thing that Israel did? Say, go to the United Nations and ask for a state. Can they do that? Isn't that fair?
Well, they gave them a state. They gave them Gaza, and they used.
They didn't, Bobby. Look at it. They cut off the water, the power, the border. That's not a state. You know that's not a state. It's technically not a state. It's legally not a state. It's a reality not a state. It's come on. It's not in the reality-based world. You think Gaza controls its own borders? You think it controls its own water and power right now? Or can Israel obliterate it at any time that it wants?
Can I answer that question? Or are you just going to start filibustering again?
No, you're the guy. I'm asking you a question. Do the Palestinians ever get to have a state? Can they go to the UN and do the same exact thing Israel did?
Okay, are you going to let me talk?
Go ahead.
Okay. You talk about the border. Well, Hamas, the day that it took over, began attacking Israel, sending commandos across, sending rockets across on civilian populations. A lot of people say, I've heard many times, that Gaza is the most densely populated place in the world. That's not true. That's not even close to true. Tel Aviv is twice as densely populated. Hamas sent 2,000 rockets a year onto civilian populations in Tel Aviv. Almost all, there's millions of Jews who live in bomb shelters because they're being attacked all the time. No other nation would put up with that. Israel did something that any nation would do, which is to put up a fence and said, we don't want any more commandos coming over here and killing our citizens. So, and then the Hamas complains, they're locking us in an open-air prison. Well, they can still leave through Egypt. So there's more than one border to Gaza. But the Israelis have said, done what any other nation would do, which is to put up a fence and say, and not only that, but Israel continued to supply water and fuel.
So no, they cannot get a state.
We were talking about something else. Of course they can get a state. They can get a state if they negotiate a peace. They say to Israel.
But you'll constantly say, well, I can't negotiate with Hamas. So it's a dead end. So who are you negotiating with?
I think, listen, if Hamas was willing to negotiate, I'd say go ahead and negotiate.
But you always say Hamas is not willing to negotiate, even when they say they are willing to negotiate. No. They just said yes to a ceasebire. Israel says no to its own ceasefire.
That's not true.
That's literally true. That just happened today, and Benny Gantz confirmed it.
No, that is not true. But let me go back to that. Hamas has in its charter a provision that says that any negotiation with Israel, except as a ruse, is a violation of Islamic law. That because Hamas is committed to the annihilation.
So you're never going to get a state because you claim Hamas is in charge. There's 3 guys left. I'm going to let them keep bombing endlessly. And those 3 guys, I don't trust them, so I'm never going to do a peace deal with them. There's nobody else to do a peace deal with. So they never get a state.
You're putting words in my mouth.
So what do you want them to do? Say like Hamas to come out, say, okay, you can kill us, and so they all get killed, and then who takes over? Who, like, there's nonstop pieces of the puzzle that you never get to it. So why can't we say, okay, screw Hamas? UN says Palestinian Authority that's in the West Bank is now in charge of both West Bank and Gaza Strip, just like we did with Israel. Palestine is now a state. Of course, my God, how long are we going to oppress these people? Do you not think they're oppressed? I mean, as president, would you just say, Israel, go ahead, do whatever the hell you want?
No, I think, of course, there's oppression, but do I blame Israel for that? Listen, I'm not a fan of Netanyahu's. I'm not a fan of Likud. I'm a long-term critic of the settlers, of Likud, of Netanyahu. I was opposed to the judicial reforms last summer. I think Israel has the greatest judiciary in the world, and his attempts to downgrade that, I think, were a disaster for the moral case for Israel. But I blame Hamas for what's going on.
That's easy. Okay, I got you. We disagree on it. We're going to move on. So, okay, now one other thing that caused me concern that I wanted to run by you. So, when you talked about the COVID vaccine, you said the Chinese and Ashkenazi Jews are less susceptible to it. So that caused me a lot of concern, Bobby. And I'll tell you why. Because you know that there's already building hatred at the time towards the Chinese, right? And so, the China virus is what Trump calls it, et cetera. And again, all the scientists say, no, it's not, it doesn't avoid the Chinese. And then Ashkenazi Jews, well, then that's a second thing that causes me concern, because then I say, wait, there's a lot of anti-Semitic tropes about how the Jews are on the world, and if there was a virus that broke out and Jewish people are exempt from it and Chinese people are exempt from it and it came from China, that sounds really dangerous. So when you said that, Bobby, A, what did you mean, right? And do you get why people were worried about that statement? Like, whoa, that seems to feed into some thoughts that are not positive for the world. So tell us, help us out.
I mean, this goes back to what you were saying at the outset, that the mainstream media reports things that I said with a certain spin on them to make them seem alarming or to make me seem crazy. So let me give you the context in which I made this, in which I had that discussion. I had a private dinner that was with some journalists, and it was under Chatham House rules. You know what that means? Chatham House rules, right?
Yep.
What does that mean?
So I hear you, but at the same time, Bobby,
let me finish.
But you said it.
Let me finish.
No, you asked me a question, but go ahead.
Let me finish. Yeah, I just wanted to, Chatham House rules mean it's off the record, that you're not allowed to report it. And we were talking about bioweapons and the growth of bioweapons, particularly with AI, and I'm deeply concerned. I just wrote a book about bioweapons, so I know a lot about them. And that there's a whole now science of ethnic bioweapons that have been that are being developed by China, by Russia, and particularly by the United States. And I made the remark that that you could actually ethnically target certain bioweapons to attack certain races. And in conjunction with that, I mentioned an NIH paper that had just been published. And anybody who wants to, who's listening to this show, can look this up. It's NIH, and what that NIH paper said was that the docking site from the spike protein, so the part of the spike protein that actually docks with the ACE2 receptors in your lungs, and it was neatly fitted so that it was more likely to affect certain races and not affect others. The most compatible races were blacks and Caucasians. The least compatible race was people from Finland, The second most was Ashkenazi Jews, and the third was Chinese. Oh, I was talking about this, never suggested that it had been developed with that intention. But what I said is that because even COVID affects, apparently, according to this study, affects some races more than more, it's a suggestion that you could develop ethnic bioweapons using that same kind of technology. So I was never suggesting that people deliberately developed or cultivated COVID as a bioweapon against certain races. I was just citing a paper, which anybody can look up. And what do you say about that? I mean, should we be able to talk about science even when it's controversial?
Well, so this gets back to the discussion we had earlier, which is that, yeah, but I just read something, and again, I'm not an expert on it. I'm not I'm not a scientist, but I read an article that quotes scientists that say that no, that it doesn't affect whites or blacks more significantly. It doesn't, and Caucasian's not really even a race.
Yeah, but I wasn't arguing that.
Etc.
I wasn't arguing that it did do that. I was just citing a peer-reviewed, published paper that said that.
So I get what you're saying.
And made those observations.
And I understand
so
what
I wasn't saying, and I don't think if you did an epidemiological study, you could show that Ashkenazi Jews did any better than Caucasians. I don't know. Oh, I would be shocked. Well, it may be that some races, there's certainly some nations that did a lot better, but we don't know why. But all I was doing was I was citing a paper. I wasn't saying that it was true. But do you get that? Look, I'm going to give you that it was. No, I'm going to explain. First, I want to give you credit. I get why you mentioned that it was off the record, because you weren't trying to make a public statement. And exactly. And if you make a public statement, then it becomes more of I intended this or that. And everybody is looking for a blood libel to use against Jews. And if you say that publicly, there are bad people out there who will take that and run with it. So I wouldn't say it publicly. Okay, so but that's what I was going to get at. I was going to say, do you get that if people think that that's the case, it's going to lead to dark paths? Yeah. Now, if it actually was the case, and we're studying it, and it turns out randomly it's a Finnish, it's Ashkenazi, it's Koreans, etc. We're going to have a conversation about that. I did it off the record. Right, we're going to have a conversation about that. But number one, it isn't, right? And number two, you acknowledge that if you just go out there without being absolutely sure of it, it's going to trigger those tropes. And well, yeah, but I wouldn't do that. Okay. I did it in a private setting, and I was remarking on a very interesting paper, and that's all. I wasn't, making a personal assertion. I wasn't vouching for the paper. Right. I was just saying it's interesting that this is out there. All right, last thing, defense. You propose what appears to be massive cuts to defense spending. So obviously they're going to fight you tooth and nail on that. The Democrats and the Republicans are totally in the tank for the defense contractors who give them millions upon millions of dollars in campaign donations, oftentimes hire them and the generals after they retire. So how much can you cut in defense? Is it realistic, and how do you get it done? Well, I mean, the amount, and listen, I've talked to all kinds of military experts about these cuts. The amount that I would cut our defense budget back to was the height of defense spending during the Cold War. It's called the Eisenhower minimum. So at the very height of the Cold War tensions, this was our military budget in 2024 real dollars. And we were told, if you remember, Cenk, in 1992, when the walls came down in Europe, that we were going to get a dividend, a peace dividend. We were told that the $600 billion military budget at that time was going to be cut back to $200 billion. Well, the real defense spending right now is up to about $1.3 trillion if you include the DOE and national security. So instead of going down to $2 billion, which was deemed adequate to protect our borders, to make us too expensive to ever invade, to protect the sea lanes and neutral areas like the Antarctic, and have a two-strike capacity in two different theaters of the globe, that was deemed enough right now. I intend to cut it in my first 4 years from the actual Defense Department budget, which is about $950 billion, to $500 billion, and look for cuts after that. So nearly half. Nearly half. And you need to do that because our country is being weakened, not because of our, a weakened military, but because of our economy. We need to bring that money back home and invest it in rebuilding the middle class in this country and rebuilding our industrial base. The real strength of a nation comes from the health of its citizens, the wealth of its citizens, the robustness of its economy, and we're losing that. Every nation, we've spent $8 trillion on wars over the past 20 years. Every nation in which we intervened is worse off than we found it. Iraq is, we killed more Iraqis than Saddam Hussein. We created ISIS. We drove 4 million refugees up to Europe. We've destabilized all the Western democracies, created Brexit as a direct result of the spillover war that we had in Syria. We pushed Iraq into a proxy posture with Iran, which was the foreign policy outcome that we tried to avoid for 20 years. And if you look at every place we intervened, the same thing. It's been a catastrophe. And now our addiction to war is creating BRICS, the emerging, the end of the dollar as the world reserve currency, and the world trade currency, and the world safe haven, which is going to be like a nuclear bomb dropping on our economy. So it's weakening us year after year. The Chinese did what my uncle wanted to do, and did. They instead of projecting military power abroad, they projected economic power. So while we were spending $8 trillion bombing bridges, roads, schools, ports, and airports, they spent $8 trillion building schools, bridges, roads, ports, and airports. And they're making friends everywhere. The Chinese are now the principal creditor in almost every nation in Latin America and almost every nation in Africa. And, my uncle did that. He refused to go to war, refused to send any combat troops abroad. He said he wanted children in Africa, when they heard of the United States, not to think of a man with a gun in a military uniform, but to think of a Peace Corps volunteer, to think of the Alliance for Progress, USAID. And those were programs he created to grow the middle class and run the oligarchies and the military dictators of those countries and grow their middle class, to give aid directly to the middle class. Today, there are more statues to my uncle, more boulevards named after him, more avenues, more universities, streets, and parks than in almost every country in Latin America, Africa, Asia, than any other president, and probably more than all other American presidents combined. And that is a good foreign policy, to have the world actually love you. And we're going to get that by projecting economic power abroad. The Chinese want world domination, but they spend a quarter to a third on their military budget that we do. They don't want a hot war with us. They want, and I'm not scared about competing with them on the economic landscapes. It's going to be good for us. It'll be good for them. It'll be good for every country in the world. That's what everybody wants from us. And it will restore our moral authority as a nation, or restore our leadership. We're going to cut back by recognizing we live in a multipolar world right now. Most of our military spending is spent not for self-defense, but to dominate the globe. The Chinese have a base and a half abroad. The Russians have one base. We have 800, and each one is looking for a fist fight. So, we need to close those bases, bring that money home, spend it growing the middle class in this country.
Well, that's very appealing. But you reminded me of one last thing. You mentioned your dad not killed by Sirhan. He was part of the night, obviously. He fired a couple of bullets, but the bullets, and I've seen you talk about this, that killed him come from the back, and Sirhan was in the front. The case you lay out is in my opinion, nearly indisputable. Then the question is, other than that particular guy, Cesar,
Eugene Cesar, he was the security guard who was holding my father's elbow, who escorted him into the ambush, and then it appears that he fired the shots that killed him, the 4 shots that killed him. And I actually had a lot of contact with him just before he died 2 years ago. I was trying to go and see him in the Philippines. And he said he would meet with me for $10,000, and then he said, 20, and then 25, and it became clear that he wasn't, real.
So, but other than that individual, who do you think was behind killing your dad and your uncle?
I never do speculation that I can't, like, if you read my Anthony Fauci book, Cenk, I never say what was going on in his head, and I never say what was going on behind the scenes. I only record what I can prove. And I have 2,200 footnotes, and nobody's found any mistakes in it. Oh, I can't tell you who it was. I can tell you that, Eugene Cesar, that Lisa Pease did the biggest book on my father, the most important book on my father's assassination. And she found that Cesar identified himself as a CIA agent. Oh, he had top secret clearance. He worked for Lockheed. I think he worked for Boeing, and he worked for Hughes Aircraft. And he had gotten the job as a security guard just 2 nights before, after my father's schedule was released. And then he was the security guard that grabbed my dad in the ballroom, took him into the kitchen where he wasn't supposed to go, led him into that ambush, and he had his own gun pulled. He was seen by 12 eyewitnesses, never denied it. And he told the police that he had pulled it to shoot at Sirhan, but there's nobody ever saw that.
Yeah.
And
the case is amazing because the bullets are about an inch from his neck, and
they were all contact shots. They all left a carbon tattoo. So in each
if he's a shot that he was trying to shoot Sirhan, and he shot your dad in the back of the neck, he's a very awful shot 4 times.
Yeah.
So, all right, well, maybe you get to solve that if you're president. I mean, that would be a hell of a thing. I mean, I imagine those are files you would want to take a look at to see what happens there. On that alone, that might be worth. Because no other president ever goes in and tells us what actually happened. So
yeah, I'm going to have transparency. So I don't know if there's UFOs or not, but everybody's going to know whatever they know as soon as I get in there. And all these the government's not supposed to be keeping secrets in a democracy.
Yeah. So Bobby, where can people find out more about your campaign?
Kennedy24.com.
Kennedy24.com. We'll have the link down below in the description box when you watch this later. And thank you to our members for allowing thoughtful conversations like this. We can't do it without you guys. You can hit the join button below. We appreciate you on that. And for all of our members, I'm actually going to do an analysis of this interview with Nina Turner next. So stay around for the members only episode. But Bobby, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for everything that you do. Thanks for really being such an eloquent protector of American values. And I love you because you have a really clear idea about what this country is supposed to look like. And I think we need to really remind Americans. I was at the Nixon Library and I gave a big speech this week, and I was really happy to see that they've got a $40 million program to start teaching civics in school again. And that was one of when I was a kid, there were 3 classes on civics that everybody had to take. And I think, one of the reasons that people so easily gave away their right to free speech and all these other constitutional rights that we saw over the past couple of years was because it wasn't really inculcated in their brains that you never do that in this country. And I think you're a guy who's, constantly reminding us of that. So I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you so much. And the parties and the media spend a lot of time dividing us, right? Next time we'll talk about how to bring everybody back together.
Yeah, and then we'll have a 20-hour discussion on Gaza.
We'll do both. We'll do both. Thank you, Bobby. Thank you, guys.